which strikes the legal requirement for 34,000 detention beds. Simple fact is that sovereign countries control their borders and have an immigration system with integrity that adheres to the rule of law. This last Friday, I visited the ICE facility in Houston, Texas. I find it interesting the numbers that they explained to me were going on today in the Houston, Corpus Christi region, which takes in the entire Gulf Coast of Texas, along with the Rio Grande, what we call the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. It informed me that we are having a massive encroachment into our country from across the border right now, approximately 100 OTMs a day, in addition to the Mexicans that are coming across the border. It's interesting as we talk to alternative to incarceration. In the Houston office alone, 64,000 plus are on alternatives to incarceration, which is almost double the amount of detention beds for the entire United States in one office. So I think that we get a better picture of what this invasion is all about. The attacks of 9/11 taught us that immigration enforcement matters. It matters to our security. The Boston Marathon attacks underscored this sobering lesson. Each year, more than 1 million aliens attempt to illegally enter the United States without proper documentation, or enter legally but overstay and violate their visas. Though reasonable people can disagree, I believe detention beds are a critical component to enforcing U.S. immigration laws and the detention and eventual removal of those aliens who entered this country illegally. Therefore, the bill recommends $2.8 billion to fully fund ICE's obligation to maintain no less than 34,000 beds. In contrast, the President request provided funds sufficient to support 31,800 beds, justifying the request by stating there's no need to support 34,000 detention beds, even though, as I speak today, those in detention are at 38,000 beds. So, looks like we got overage, not shortage. In fact, however, this is repudiated completely. As of last Friday, and continuing on, more than 38,000 illegal immigrants are being held in ICE custody, many of whom meet the mandatory detention requirements. Second, by the administration's own estimate, there is at least 1.9 million removable criminal aliens in the United States. There is a general acknowledgement of the illegal alien population of approximately 11 million. That estimate goes up to as high as 20 million in some quarters. Clearly, detention beds are necessary. This bed mandate is needed. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. For what reason does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of the Deutsch-Foster amendment, and I commend my colleagues for addressing one of the major problems in this bill. Once again, this bill sets an arbitrary minimum of 34,000 ICE detention beds, whether or not ICE needs them, whether or not the population it is managing on a given day warrants detention. This detention bed mandate denies ICE the flexibility it needs to manage its enforcement and removal resources in response to changing circumstances. It prevents ICE from making full use of cheaper, alternative forms of supervision when that's appropriate. The specific number of beds is not the main issue here. The problem is attempting to micromanage detention operations from the floor of this House, and doing it, by the way, in a way that wastes money and reduces flexibility. I've never understood why we would want to do that, and yet this keeps appearing in the bill produced by our majority colleagues. Once again, we need to remove this provision, and I commend Mr. Deutsch, Mr. Foster for focusing attention on this so effectively. I urge adoption of their amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition? Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of Mr. Deutsch's and Mr. Foster's amendment. I think it's absolutely astonishing. We can have a conversation about different people who are here undocumented and whether or not they ought to be in detention, and whether or not they have a criminal record, and whether they're a danger to our country. But to say that we're going to say 34,000 beds have to be filled, no matter what, is so un-American. It's so un-American to say we're going to build X number of prison cells, and then no matter what the law says, we're going to fill them. We start with the need to fill the cell. What the Deutsch-Foster amendment would do would be to strike that mandate. It doesn't strike the idea that some people are going to be detained. It strikes the idea that we have to fill what Janet Napolitano, who is the Homeland Security Secretary, just said is arbitrary. These mandated levels effectively mean that ICE, our immigration system, can't make detention decisions based on risk to our country, to our people, risk, the various agency priorities. Its officers have to focus instead on filling daily quotas. And as a result, growing numbers of immigrants are held in detention. In fiscal year 2011 alone, ICE detained 429,000 people. Now let's talk about those people. Some of them are dangerous criminals, but most are not. Over half of the immigrants detained in 2009 and 2010 had zero criminal history. Of those who did, about 20% had only traffic violations. Only 11% of the detainees with felony convictions had committed violent crimes. And so included among those detained are victims of trafficking, families with small children, elderly individuals, individuals with serious medical and mental health conditions. Many of those detained have U.S. citizen children or spouses and deep ties to their American families and their communities. Many have potential claims for lawful status, but still are detained for months or even years. Some are even survivors of torture seeking asylum in the United States. In my district, the Heartland Alliance Marjorie Kovler Center works with survivors of torture and emphasizes that placing these individuals in detention can be particularly traumatic, even replicating the feeling of vulnerability that they experience during their torture. And the irony is this: detaining large numbers of immigrants who have no criminal convictions except immigration charges does not make us safer. It is not necessary to enforce immigration law. We don't need it to enforce the immigration law. And it represents a major waste of taxpayer dollars, each detainee costing the government around $164 a day to hold. I understand why the prison industry, the private prisons in particular, would love to see $164 and set this goal of detaining all these people every day. So we should detain people because they pose a threat to our communities, not to meet congressionally mandated quotas. The criminal justice system does use a range of cheaper and effective custody options: electronic monitoring, house arrest. Alternatives to detention cost between 30 cents and $14 per individual per day, far less than our current spending on detention. So we're making real progress toward immigration reform. The Senate is considering language that would allow undocumented immigrants to come out of the shadows and earn the chance to pursue their American dream. I want to tell you, as a first-generation American, I find this policy so offensive to me. And my district, one of the most diverse in the country, to say we have to fill prison beds with these people, whether or not they're criminals, whether or not they pose harm to our country. This is not who we are as Americans. These provisions don't make us safer. They don't solve the immigration challenges they face. They are a waste of taxpayer money. I urge the support of the Deutsch-Foster Amendment in promoting real immigration reform. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I agree strongly with the impassioned plea by my colleague from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky. I'm very grateful for this amendment to be brought forward by Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Foster. This really is an outrage. It's an outrage to our values as Americans, and frankly, it's an outrage to taxpayers. The cost of holding an immigrant overnight is $120. We have viable and proven alternatives to detention that we should be using for non-criminal aliens. Again, what we're talking about here are different folks. When we're talking about criminal aliens, I don't think there's any dispute that to the extent we have criminal aliens, and at any given time this can be approximately 40% of the people or so in detention. When I visited the ICE facility in Aurora, they keep them separate. They wear different colored jumpsuits. They're criminal aliens, and they are whom, however many we have that have been apprehended for a crime subject to deportation orders, it's perfectly fair to be kept in some form of detention. But the majority, 60%, are non-criminal aliens. They were in the wrong place in the wrong time. Could have been a taillight out. Could have been going 10 miles over the speed limit. And yet we as taxpayers are removing non-criminal aliens from their homes, from being the breadwinner for their family, for supporting their kids, and being an asset to our country, and instead turning them into a liability for taxpayers to the tune of $120 a day. So again, I don't see how this makes fiscal sense at all. We're paying for free room, free board, food, medical services. All of these are being provided at taxpayer cost for folks. How is this a good deal for Americans? It just doesn't make any sense to me when we have at 1/10 the cost alternatives to detention that include call-ins, ankle bracelets. There's a comprehensive program for non-criminal aliens that can do it at a much less expensive cost. And by the way, in detention, many of them remain for a period of months. I even talked to folks, non-criminal aliens, who had been in limbo for over a year, some approaching 2 years. So yes, anybody who opposes this amendment is saying U.S. taxpayers should foot the bill for food and board and health care for somebody who's here illegally for 2 years. Why do people want to subsidize our illegal population? It's absolutely absurd. Common sense measure, however many beds we need for criminal aliens, let's have. However many we need for non-criminal aliens in terms of alternatives to detention, let's do. Obviously, what we really need is comprehensive immigration reform to address this issue. There's no way that I don't even think people on either side of the aisle in this chamber think that we should pay for 12 million people to be detained at the cost of $120 a day. I can't even add that up in my own mind, but I can tell you it would be a deficit buster right there. So let's start here. Let's address our deficit. Let's make sure that we keep families together. Don't take parents away from kids. Don't force taxpayers to buy medical care and lodging and food for people who aren't even in this country illegally. And we can do that right here, right now, by passing the Deutsch Amendment. I call upon my colleagues to join me in doing so, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise in support of this important amendment by Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Foster. First of all, this is the right thing to do. But to bring the conversation back to what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle pivot to in almost every policy discussion we have in this body, cutting spending. In a budget age where many in this body celebrate the draconian and harmful cuts of the sequester, it seems we've come to accept as the norm indiscriminate, across-the-board cuts that in many cases fall on the backs of those most vulnerable among us. Cutting spending in this Congress no longer equates to targeted cuts to inefficient or duplicative government programs to root out waste. Cutting spending in this climate is simply about the bottom line. But it doesn't have to be that way. This amendment is the perfect example of how we can cut spending in a smart and efficient way while defending those most vulnerable. By ending the arbitrary 34,000 bed mandate for immigration detention, we can cut spending and do the right thing. How's this for a bottom line? Alternatives to immigration detention save money. We're spending more than $5 million a day to detain immigrants, 45% of which have no criminal record, according to the Human Rights Watch. That equates to roughly $164 per day per detainee for detention and roughly $2 billion per year. Alternatives to detention, on the other hand, only cost between 30 cents and $14 per day per detainee, and they have proven safe and effective. According to Julie Myers-Wood, who ran ICE under President Bush, 96% of individuals enrolled in alternatives to detention show up for their final hearing, and 84% comply with removal orders. So what's stopping us from putting in place these effective cost-saving policies? Another harmful appropriations policy rider, mandating a daily detention level of 34,000 immigrants. In no other law enforcement context do we impose such a ridiculous quota. You wouldn't tell a county jail or a state prison that you have to keep X number of prisoners in that facility. Mandating such a high level of detention makes absolutely no sense. By doing so, ICE is effectively prohibited from making decisions about detention based on enforcement policies, efficiency, and need. All too often in this body, we look for someone else to blame. But in this case, we have no one to blame for this wasteful policy but ourselves. We have the power to change a policy that does nothing but waste the taxpayers' money and cause undue hardship to immigrant families across the country. I urge my colleagues to vote for increased efficiency and compassion and urge a yes vote on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I've listened to the argument from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I find it interesting. First, those who cross into our country without, and contrary to the laws of this great nation, have committed an illegal act, and, you know, calling them not illegal doesn't make them not illegal. But I really would like to point out that we have a curious way to discuss this as a policy, and that is no one here stands responsible for the decision. You know, when the alternatives to incarceration were created by judges, for the judicial system stands in a little different situation than the members of Congress. When one of these people who's let out on alternatives to incarceration, in fact, commit another criminal act, and believe me, it happens, nothing more than just DWI when you run over a little kid, the judge who puts him on that particular form is held responsible. And he's not going to read his name in the newspaper that he put that person out that should have been in jail out on an alternative to incarceration. Or if the person commits another criminal act even more severe, murder, rape, robbery, if it happens when the judge puts them out on alternatives, the judge has to take the heat. But as we have this great policy debate in Congress, no one who is arguing to release all these people on alternatives is taking any heat at all on what the accomplishments in the criminal realm will be of those we release. I approve of alternatives to incarceration. I just told you that 64,000 people alone in the city of Houston's jurisdiction, which is the valley all the way up to Beaumont, are out on alternatives. But detention beds are also full and overflowing. And when I visited the ICE unit there, the red uniforms were the majority, and the red uniforms are criminal aliens. They have committed crimes in this country. And so I think we are being a little bit safe to make these arguments as we stand here in these hallowed halls. Never is our name going to appear in any newspaper when one of these people commits an act that causes damage to our fellow citizens. And yet we make this argument very passionately. I just want to remind everybody that we are responsible for those criminal aliens that we release. And criminal aliens are right now being released. And in fact, Ms. Napolitano, after I asked her specifically, are you releasing anyone from detention? And she looked me right in the eye and said, no. And 2 days later, she released 2,300. So don't tell me, and of those 2,300, in the top two categories were both represented in that release. The most serious and the second most serious categories of crimes we hold people for. So this is a policy, this administration continues to have a policy of not enforcing the law, and quite frankly, we need this availability of beds so we can enforce the law. I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Aye. And those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. The clerk will read.
Page 15, line 4, automation modernization, $34,900,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2016. Construction, $5 million to remain available until September 30th, 2017. Transportation Security Administration, Aviation Security, $4,872,739,000.
Clerk will suspend. For what purpose the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection, the clerk will now designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to describe his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would completely eliminate funding for the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, and transfer that money to the spending reduction account, saving taxpayers nearly $5 billion. Congress intended for TSA to be an efficient, cutting-edge, intelligence-based agency responsible for protecting our airports and keeping our passengers safe and secure. But today it has grown into one of the largest bureaucracies in the federal government. They've had a 400% increase in staff since they were created. A good portion of those are headquarters employees making six-figure incomes on the average. What's worse is that the American passengers aren't getting a good return on the more than $60 billion investment that they've spent on TSA. Reports indicate that more than 25,000, repeat, 25,000 security breaches have occurred in U.S. airports since 2001. Plus, we have evidence today that terrorists on the no-fly list still have been able to board U.S. aircraft. Terrorists boarding U.S. aircraft in spite of TSA. Furthermore, we've seen report after report on TSA employees displaying a lack of professionalism, being inadequately trained, and even engaging in theft and other illegal activities. Just about the only thing that the TSA is consistently good at is using its extensive power to violate American travelers' civil liberties. Veterans, the disabled, the elderly, and even small children have been the victims of overly invasive searches by TSA officers. This is all evidence that the TSA has veered dangerously off course. I've repeatedly asked that we use our resources to focus on intelligence and technologies that could be more effective when it comes to catching terrorists. I've called for the privatization of TSA, and so have many other of my colleagues. But we still yet to see the necessary changes made to the TSA personnel or to its procedures that will ensure the safety and security of our airports and passengers. Mr. Chairman, this amendment to zero out funding for the TSA forces Congress and the Department of Homeland Security to start from scratch on a leaner, more effective, and more focused and a more productive system for protecting our U.S. citizens. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Mr. Chairman, the simple fact is this amendment is unnecessary and harmful to national security, in my opinion. Now, am I happy with TSA? No. I have criticism of TSA also. Most people who travel have some criticism of TSA. But zeroing out TSA and leaving our airports unsecure is not the solution to the problem. If the gentleman's argument is that we're being fiscally responsible to do away with the TSA part of this budget, I would argue the contrary. This bill, quite frankly, has made cuts, and in fact, for 4 years now, we have reduced spending in this bill. That's not a good argument. It's easy to get mad at somebody that interferes with your life every time you travel, especially when you travel every week. But the reality is, this will be a mistake to national security. This will be a mistake to our country. And even though we have criticism of TSA, our job is to fix TSA, not abolish TSA. And I know there's plenty of folks that think that's abolishing is a good idea, but quite honestly, it would be a real tragedy to leave our airports undefended. We need to make them better. And I think one of the things we're doing is the oversight that we provided in this bill so that we can take a hard look at DHS across the board and come up with solutions where things need to be fixed. And of course, if TSA is on the radar screen, they ought to be fixed. But I think this is a mistake. I think it's bad policy. I think it's good grandstanding, but bad policy. And I oppose the gentleman's amendment. Yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I join the subcommittee chairman in strong opposition to this amendment. The gentleman's amendment would eliminate entirely the TSA aviation security account from this bill, more than $4.8 billion. Now, I oppose this dangerous amendment on numerous grounds, but I'm most appalled by the fact that it includes no language on who, if not TSA, would be securing our nation's airports, and under what authority, what guidelines. If this amendment were to pass, not only would the public not worry about bringing knives on planes, but terrorists would be able to bring guns and explosives on planes. Surely the sponsor can't be suggesting that as an acceptable outcome of this amendment. I just have to say the job of this subcommittee and of this bill is to provide for the defense of our homeland. That's our bottom line obligation, and this amendment is in direct contradiction to that obligation. So I urge the resounding defeat of this amendment, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. And those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. For the purposes the gentleman from Colorado rise.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Tipton of Colorado. Page 15, line 20, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $3 million. Page 15, line 24, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $3 million. Page 16, line 10, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $3 million. Page 19, line 15, after the dollar amount, insert reduced by $4 million.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to describe his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today with an amendment that cuts $4 million from the Transportation Security Administration and provides these resources for small and rural airports. Airports that have had important passenger screening devices removed as a result of the Federal Aviation Administration's Modernization Act. Passengers in the rural airports of my district, including Yampa Valley, Montrose, Gunnison, Durango, they've all been impacted by unnecessary delays and intrusions because of the removal of security screening devices that were sent to larger airports. In the interest of protecting passenger privacy, the FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012 required the use of automated target recognition scanners, or Gumby scanners, at all airports by June 1st of 2012. While the intent of Congress was admirable and protecting the privacy of passengers should be a priority, TSA's interpretation and implementation of the laws caused numerous problems for passengers traveling from small and rural airports throughout the country. One of TSA's manufacturers who provided equipment for passenger screening could not comply with the changes in the law and provide new equipment. As a result, TSA decided to remove 174 of these non-compliant machines throughout the country. Rather than waiting for funding for new machines or finding alternative ways to be able to fix this problem, TSA made the arbitrary decision of taking compliant scanners from small and rural airports throughout the country and giving them to larger airports that lost their non-compliant scanners. One alternative could have been the cost-effective private federal alternative screening model that was put forth by then House Transportation Chairman John Mica, that would have saved billions of dollars and not compromised the security at small and rural airports. TSA's implication that security checkpoints at small and rural airports are somehow less critical is inaccurate. Once passengers clear screening at small and rural airports, they typically do not receive additional screening for connecting flights at other larger potential airports. The amendment will assist with reducing unnecessary delay for passengers at small and rural airports by providing funding to be able to speed up the replacement of security equipment removed by the TSA. It is important to note that the funds being redirected from TSA toward improving passenger screening at small airports come from its administrative budget and as such do not impact passenger security. There are numerous concerns with transparency and waste in the TSA budget, including a recent agreement by the TSA to purchase $50 million worth of new uniforms that are unnecessary, wasting approximately $212 million each year on the inefficient SPOT program and billions on the Transportation Worker Identification Credential program. I believe that these resources could be better used and used more efficiently to screen passengers at small airports, strengthen security, prevent delays, and avoidable intrusions. I encourage my colleagues to join me in support of this common sense amendment. With that, I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I share some of these concerns with the gentleman from Colorado, and I believe that outstanding questions still remain over the timetable or timeline for replacing the AIT scanners. I expect TSA to sufficiently answer the question posed here today. I urge TSA to move forward with the replacement of AIT scanners at the affected airports as soon as possible. I commit to the gentleman from Colorado that the committee will look into this issue further and do everything within its power to fix the problem to the extent that it does not cost the American taxpayers more money. It's my understanding that this amendment will not result in the need for additional TSA screeners. Therefore, I accept the amendment.
What What purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I, too, would suggest that for now we accept this amendment and continue to work on the problems that the amendment highlights. My understanding from TSA is that they have prior year funding available to replace detection machines that were removed due to the FAA Modernization Act. The machines that were removed didn't meet certain privacy standards and were removed at the cost of the contractor. TSA is currently testing new machines that could be used to replace the roughly 250 that were removed from airports across the country. And clearly, of course, this needs to be done. So I'll be happy to work with the gentleman to press TSA to move at an expeditious pace to replace these with more advanced machines. And I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. And those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Would the gentleman please submit his amendment to the desk? We don't seem to have it.
Yes, sir. It's an amendment offered by Mr. Micah of Florida, DeFazio of Oregon, and Hudson of North Carolina.
Amendment 10.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 10, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Hudson of North Carolina.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to describe his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today to encourage my colleagues to support our amendment, which strengthens the Federal Flight Deck Officer, or FFDO, program. Our amendment increases funding for the FFDO by $12.5 million, bringing the total authorized for the program to $25 million, with the Congressional Budget Office reporting no budgetary impact. Since its creation in 2003, this program has provided training to pilots who are willing to step up and volunteer to protect their fellow citizens by defending the airliners that millions of Americans fly on every year. As part of TSA's risk-based approach to aviation security, which I strongly advocated for on the Homeland Security Committee, the FFDO program plays an integral role in providing an additional layer of security against hijacking or terrorist attack. Since inception, FFDOs have protected thousands of flights each day and over hundreds of thousand flights a month, all at a fraction of the cost to taxpayers compared to the Federal Air Marshal Service. As the first line of deterrence and the last line of defense, it only makes sense that we should continue to provide adequate funding to the FFDO program. While zeroed out in the President's budget, we believe the FFDO program provides a cost-effective solution in protecting passengers aboard our airliners. I applaud Chairman Rogers, Subcommittee Chairman Carter, and the Appropriations Committee for finding ways to prioritize spending so this program did not meet its demise. With that said, $12.5 million represents more than a 50% cut from last year's amount. At this level of funding, the FFDO program would be unable to recertify all of the pilots currently in the program, maintain its current management structure, or train any additional officers. We have offered a responsible and fully offset amendment that moves $12.5 million to the FFDO program to ensure that we are using our resources wisely and in a manner that will directly benefit America's safety. The House unanimously agreed to a similar amendment offered in the FY13 Homeland Appropriations bill, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in this year in providing support that such a valuable program deserves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
It's been nearly a decade since, on a bipartisan basis against bipartisan opposition, we fought and were successful in creating the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. Since that time, over 100,000, hundreds of thousands of flights have been protected by armed pilots. Now, there was controversy at the beginning. Could we trust pilots with guns? Well, we trust them with our lives. We trust them with planes that were used as weapons of mass destruction by the terrorists in 2011. Of course, we can trust them with guns, but they need proper training because it's an unusual environment in which to possess and use a weapon. And use a weapon as the last line of defense should a plane be taken over by terrorists. We've done other things to provide security, federal air marshals, armored flight decks, but still, we know that this program is essential. It's inexpensive, and it is something that pilots want to do. There were openings last year for a few additional training spots. Over 1,000 people volunteered for those slots. Many, obviously, were not chosen. If this program were eliminated, as was proposed in the President's budget, or even if it's cut in half, and I appreciate the fact that the committee has labored to find money to restore half the funding, many officers will not be recertified. New officers will not be allowed to join, and we will lose this last critical line of defense, and one that is wonderfully random. A terrorist could never, ever know if the pilots on that plane were armed. It's pretty hard to spot the air marshals, but it's even impossible to know what the pilot has behind that locked flight deck door. So we're recommending an amendment to our colleagues that would take money out of other parts of the bureaucracy of the TSA at no increase in debt or deficit and fully fund this program so that thousands of pilots can continue to participate meaningfully as the last line of defense against a future terrorist attack. I think this amendment has tremendous common good sense about it. It's very cost effective, and I would hope that my colleagues will join us on a bipartisan basis in supporting it. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I ask to strike the last word.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank particularly the committee leadership, Mr. Carter, Mr. Price, and the staff. They've done an excellent job in trying to put into appropriations language and amounts of money expended, reforms that are long overdue in TSA. I'm pleased to join Mr. Hudson, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. DeFazio, my colleague, gentleman from Oregon, and this bipartisan amendment to restore the $25 million for the flight deck officer program. I can't for the life of me understand why the Obama administration would propose to Congress that we zero out one of the most cost-effective mechanisms we have to ensure the safety and security of the flying public. Now, this program costs $25 million, and that's out of a $5 billion expenditure for TSA. $25 million. It is probably the most cost-effective layer of security that we have. Just a few dollars underwriting, again, the expense of training these pilots who've asked for the ability to protect their aircraft themselves and their passengers. We put this in place. Everyone was against it. Well, you heard Mr. DeFazio, the story of this. The Senate was against it, the administration was against it, the airlines were against it. We brought it out here in a demo project, and the House overwhelmingly voted to support this program, and it's done it time and time again because it is cost effective. It's a good layer of security. Now let me tell you what these pilots do. These pilots go at their own expense. They're not paid per diem. They're not paid for the flight. I went out to visit the program, and I have to admit, whether it was a Republican administration or a Democrat administration, everybody tried to do the program in. So they put the training facility almost on the border of Mexico. I had to take 3 flights, one to Denver, one to Albuquerque, and another one
another jumper flight and then drive almost 2 hours to the border to get to this flight facility. That's what these pilots are doing on their own dollar for a week-long training program that, again, this is the cost of that training program, but the expense is borne by the pilot. I saw men, I saw women, I saw pilots for cargo, passenger, all going to get this training. Why would you want to end a program that is so cost-effective and gives us this protection? So I don't want to belabor this. Mr. Hudson, Mr. DeFazio have stated the case well. Thousands and thousands of flights are protected, and thousands of pilots participate on their own dime. I urge the passage of this amendment. Yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moments ago, the TSA administrator announced that he will reverse his earlier decision to allow knives back onto airplanes, and knives will now continue to be a part of the prohibited items list on our aircraft, making our passenger and our crew more safe. This is positive news. However, the administration's desire to zero out this FFDO program, allowing our pilots, our trained pilots, to be armed on the aircraft, puts us in a position that will put us more at risk, will put passengers and flight crew more at risk. And the TSA not allowing knives on planes, that's just one step for passenger and crew safety, when we need a comprehensive approach to keep our passenger and crew safe, which would include not allowing knives on planes, which would include risk-based screening, which would include, as my friends from the other side have talked about, increasing funding for intelligence operations to make sure we know who are getting on these airplanes. But it would also mean keeping the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program fully funded. And this is a program I know about because of a personal friend in Livermore, California, who was a Southwest airline pilot, and I have seen firsthand over the last 7 years how serious he has trained to be ready for this program. And as my friend and colleague from the other side just mentioned, they fly down to Texas routinely to train down there, and they are very diligent. They do this many times on their own dime, and a lot of skill and effort is put into their training to make sure that if something dangerous were to happen on that aircraft, they would be prepared. And it's a task they take seriously, and it's a task we want them to continue to be supported by in the federal government. So to have comprehensive airline passenger security, we want to restore the federal dollars for this, put it back at $25 million, and I appreciate that this amendment was offered. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I accept the amendment and yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina. Those in favor say aye, and those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. What purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Move to strike the last word for the purpose of a colloquy.
The gentleman is recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As chair of the House Transportation Security Subcommittee, I want to raise my concern about a delay in finalizing a rule to improve the security of FAA-approved domestic and foreign repair stations. This rulemaking, mandated by Congress in 2003 and again in 2007, has languished for almost 10 years. By way of background, TSA signed off on the rule late last year, and DHS completed consideration early this year. The Office of Management and Budget is currently reviewing the rule. I hope that OMB will complete this rulemaking by June 14, 2013, which is the end of the 90-day clock for their consideration. At this time, I will yield to my colleague from Texas, Chairman Carter.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I share the gentleman from North Carolina's concern in the House Appropriations Committee including report language asking for final action on this rule. It is well past time to finalize this rule, whose delay has impeded manufacturers in growing critical markets for aviation exports. Yield to Mr. Price. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. At this time, I'd like to yield to my colleague from North Carolina, Congressman Price.
I thank my colleague for yielding and very much appreciate my fellow North Carolinian raising this issue. I agree with his assessment that OMB needs to finalize this rule as soon as possible. It's critical to establish this risk-based security regime for these repair stations. So we do hope for a rapid conclusion of this protracted episode, and I appreciate him for raising the matter. Appreciate his raising the matter. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Time.
Chairman, I have it.
What purpose the gentleman from Florida
Mr.
rise?
Chairman, I have a amendment at the desk, and it's Micah Amendment 8, designated and pre-printed.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Micah of Florida.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to describe his amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, first again, I want to thank the Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price for their excellent work, and again his staff. They have gone through some of the expenditures for TSA, and not only in the dollar amounts but also in the language that's contained supporting their appropriations measures, some excellent provisions. Now, I do offer this amendment, which is no greater increase in spending, but does move some money around from TSA administration to support our private screening ship partnership program. As you heard earlier from one of the speakers, this program is very successful. It's cost-effective, and many airports want to avail themselves of it. TSA has thwarted all the efforts to increase the private screening under federal supervision and come up with a whole host of excuses. And also, they have cooked the books as far as the cost of operating these private screening operations. Now, you got to remember that if you look at this bill, it puts a limit of 46,000 screeners, I believe. In the past, we've increased that from 40,000. Mr. Rogers and I did that some time ago. We actually, if you go online, you'll find 51,000 screeners. We're not sure exactly what the figure is right now. It may be less than that. But there are a total of 66,000 TSA employees. So that leaves approximately 15,000, even at our most conservative estimate of the number of people in administration. Right now there's close to $1.2 billion spent on non-screener salaries. It's $1.19 billion to be exact in this bill. So this moves a small amount of money, $20-some million, over to, again, the private screening account. I think it's justified. I think we're going to need it. And I have several amendments that I'm going to offer in a minute that I'd like to expand again on the size of the bureaucracy and what TSA is doing to thwart the privatization effort that could bring cost-effective screening to play and do a better job and save taxpayers money. So with that, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks time? Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman. For what purpose, gentleman from Texas rise?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I accept this amendment.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
From North Carolina, seek time.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The gentleman's amendment would provide an additional $32 million for the screening partnership program. I have no objection to the concept of the screening partnership program. It's a local, if a local airport authority applies to participate in the program and a private company can provide screening in accordance with TSA standards and costs, then so be it. In fact, this bill increases funding for the SPP by $15.6 million over current year levels and $10 million above the request in anticipation of the program's vast expansion. But I'm unaware of a surge in demand for participation in the SPP that would warrant a 30% increase in funding for this program. And the offset for the amendment is aviation security, direction, and enforcement, which the bill already cuts by $20 million below the request. Now, Mr. Chairman, should additional demand warrant funding for the SPP above what is already provided in this bill, we can work with the TSA to transfer funding to meet that demand. But it simply makes no sense to provide such a significant increase for the SPP when it's almost certain that those additional funds are going to go unused. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without any other members seeking time, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor shall say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose, gentleman from
I have an
For what
amendment.
purpose, gentlelady from Nevada, rise?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise today to voice my objections to the limits placed on DHS regarding the UASI grant program. My district is slated to lose $2 million due to the limit of awards to only 25 UASI grantees. While I believe that counterterrorism funding should go to the places that need it the most, an arbitrary cap along with a flawed formula is not helping our nation's efforts to prepare for or respond to natural disasters and potential terrorist attacks. I've voiced these concerns on a number of occasions over the past few months with DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano, and I appreciate her willingness to work with me on this issue. I want to acknowledge other members of our Nevada delegation for joining with me today to work on this issue through a proposed amendment, but I have a number of reservations about their approach. I'm concerned about reductions in salary accounts for agencies that are charged with keeping our nation safe and prepared for all types of emergencies. Furthermore, their amendment provides additional funding but not additional instruction. So there is no guarantee that additional cities like Las Vegas will receive any of this increased funding in the amendment. I'm proud to represent Las Vegas, one of the premier vacation and business destinations in the world. Ensuring that my constituents and millions of visitors who we welcome every year stay safe is a top priority of our local government and law enforcement. Without UASI funding to sustain and enhance our regional capabilities, Las Vegas, as well as our portion of the large FEMA Region 9, will be at a significant disadvantage in preparedness, response, and recovery capabilities. Hundreds of thousands of people gather in large venues in southern Nevada every day. 15 of the world's 25 largest hotels are in my district on the Las Vegas Strip, with a total of over 62,000 rooms. In 2012, some 37.5 million visitors came to Las Vegas, and over 21,000 conventions are held each year. On any given day, tens of thousands of tourists walk along the 4.2-mile Las Vegas Strip, just a few miles from critical federal assets, including Nellis Air Force Base, Creech Air Force Base, as well as the National Nuclear Security Site and Boulder Dam. Mr. Chairman, I believe that counterterrorism funding decisions should be made using forward-looking, risk-based metrics. It's critical that DHS update their decision-based matrix to reflect these principles. DHS does not accurately count expected visitors in their decision-making process. And it's important to remember that visitors to our city would need the most assistance in the event of a national disaster or terrorist attack because they are unfamiliar with the area as well as with local evacuation and safety plans. In Las Vegas, we welcome over 40 million travelers to our city this year, and that's an increase of over 400,000 last year. We're also expecting our local population to continue to grow. Yet despite these increases and increases in other components of our risk profile, Las Vegas actually slipped in DHS risk rankings. This fall in ranking caused the city to fall out of contention for a grant, and it was announced that we will not receive the funding we need. This is not good planning and should be remedied immediately. I pledge to work with my colleagues from districts with other tourist destinations and with the Secretary to be sure that the formulas are updated and improved and that the funding goes to where it is truly needed. I thank you and yield back.
Generally yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's designated in the pre-printed amendments, Micah 6.
Designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Micah of Florida.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman and members of the House, I have this amendment and I have several others. I'm going to combine my remarks